So I wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to be here today. MentorAbility, Ashley and I are really excited to hear and speak about this important topic, unconscious bias, impacting our community and workplace. And I think it's important for all of us to explore our unconscious bias that we all have. And we're thrilled to be able to bring this conversation to all you today, featuring such an amazing speaker and leader like Anne. But before we get started, it's a couple of housekeeping. For those who don't know, MentorAbility is a national supported employment initiative that provides opportunities, education, and awareness to be shared between employers and people experiencing a disability in communities across Canada. So this initiative offers a unique mentoring experience for job seekers with disabilities. And Ashley and I are the two regional coordinators for Atlantic Canada. I have Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and Ashley has Newfoundland and PEI. So I'm really excited to see a lot of people on this call today and on this webinar, and we are looking forward to collaborating in the future. The webinar will be around 70 to 90 minutes in total. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box as we go along. Ashley and I will keep an eye on it and bring anything forward. If you have any technical issues or you can't hear anything, please let us know in the chat box or in the Q&A box, so we will try to help you. This is all kind of new to us as well, so be a little patient with us. And then the other thing, we have two more webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks, one with Danny Graham, a lawyer and former leader of the Nova Scotia Liberal Party, who's going to talk about the importance of community collaboration and coordination in advocacy for persons with disabilities. And then another webinar on Thursday, July 30th with international disability advocate Mark Wafer, and he's going to speak on the business case for real inclusion. Okay, so we're really excited to have Anne, the CEO of Ashanti Leadership and Development Services. She provides extensive career and professional guidance and leadership development. Her work is underpinned by her knowledge and expertise in human rights and people management. Anne's unique style, combined with adult education principles, has brought her recognition in her fields of leadership development, change management, coaching and mentoring, facilitation, diversity and inclusion, and more recently, unconscious bias training to support business environment, public sector, and the government to bring their best self to work. So, enough of me, over to Anne.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and I'm so delighted to be here. And I'd like to say thank you to Ashley and Marcus. Thank you for the confidence that you have in me. So it means that I've got to really deliver today and perform. So this is a very, very important topic. It's very important to me because I believe in human rights principles, because first and foremost, what guides me, what takes me along this path, along this journey, is the belief that we are all equal in rights and dignity. So let me tell you a story. I want to tell you two stories before I go to the slide that I have presented today. First of all, I want to say, well, why do I want to spend my time talking about this topic, unconscious bias and disabilities? What gives me permission to do so? What gives me the knowledge? And so how do I understand, what is my understanding of this? But I will share that with you. But before I go any further, I want to acknowledge, if we could go to slide 2, that, you know, we are here together. And I want to welcome you in the spirit of connectedness. And that connectedness is a recognition that we are on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. We work, we live, we play on this land that belongs to our Mi'kmaq people, the first peoples of Nova Scotia. Slide 2, please. And so we are what our Prime Minister and our Premier have often said, if you can go to slide 2, please, Marcus, that we are all treaty people. Slide 2.
There we go.
And because we as non-native people, we need to understand, or we need to be able to accept our responsibility that we have that centers around injustice and the suffering and the broken promises that as a result of European settlement, we have a responsibility to each other. We have a responsibility to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Thanks very much. Next slide, please. So, I also want to say that we cannot engage in a conversation around unconscious bias without not talking about the diverse communities in which we are living here in Nova Scotia. And as I said, we have the responsibility to treat everyone with respect and dignity. We also have to acknowledge that as, well, it's not just Nova Scotia. I understand who's on the line. At the time I was thinking of Nova Scotia, but I want to think about Canada in general, that we need to acknowledge that we are united and that we are all in this together. So can we move to the next slide? And when I say that we are all in this together, it must be acknowledged that we're living in unprecedented and extraordinary times. Particularly for Nova Scotians, as the world stood, or the country, well, indeed the world, because people were contacting me from the UK, where I'm from, and was asking me, how are you in Nova Scotia? I heard about the mass killings. Is that close to you? So in a sense, we came together in collective grief because we also had lost several officers, if we remember, the naval officers who were lost. And so it didn't matter that we had to do some social distancing. We all came together in a collective grief, and we all stood together, and we stood together as one. We stood together as human beings. Yes? Can we move on, please? So, as Canadians, this is what our Prime Minister has taught us, that, you know, we have a dream, we have a belief that diversity is our strength. And we are strong, not because, in spite of our differences, but because of our differences. And so therefore, as we move forward that in order for us to be successful, it doesn't matter. That strength lies in our cultural diversity, our political and our economic diversity. So that's very important for us here in Canada. It's something that we pride ourselves in. But also, if we would move on to the next slide, we also have to recognize that there have been some dark pathways, even though these goals that we have are aspirational, because we still have issues with our Indigenous peoples. We just had the report last year about the national inquiry into the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. If we move over to the next slide, we will see that Canada's pathway, in the words of our Prime Minister, it has to be acknowledged that we do have some dark moments in our history. We have the Chinese head tax, the internment of the Ukrainians, the Japanese, Italians, during the First and Second World War. And we also know that during the Holocaust, we turned away both of Jewish people as well as Punjabi refugees, and not to mention our own history in slavery, which has been silent for a long time, but increasingly have been coming to the fore, particularly around the War of 1812. And then we have most recently, the world stood still in these two pandemics, where we have George Floyd, who was killed at the hands of a white police officer. And we also had this international pandemic, really, where a significant number of persons with disabilities, the elderly, Black people, people of color, who died during this process. Thanks. Our next slide. So When we talk about unconscious bias and we talk about persons with disabilities, you know, most of us like to think that we are good people. We like to think that we treat everyone fairly, or at least we would shudder to think if someone were to say that we were not and that we were biased in nature, or that we don't want to say that we were racist, homophobic, or even have bad thoughts about a person with a disability, a Muslim, or even a Black person. We all like to believe that we are good people, and we want to be with those people who are very much like ourselves. So coming back to my story as to why do you think someone like me can speak to this issue? Well, I've had disability around me all my life. My dad's eldest sister was disabled. She had polio. And growing up in Guyana as a young person, I remember the age of 8. She was a very, very independent person. In fact, she ran my grandmother's household in spite of her disability. She could grab you faster than anyone else, and her strength was of such that once she gripped you, you could not escape. And my job was to accompany her every Saturday as she went out from village to village selling her patisseries and baked goods. Now, that was highly embarrassing to me as a child because I wanted to be with my friends on a Saturday, playing out, having a good time. And here we are on the hot, dusty roads, having to push my aunt she had a tricycle that my dad and uncles had sent to her to Guyana from England, and she had more power in our hands, so that was where the pedals were. You know, and for me, that was a difficult period in my life because I could not really understand why it had to be me. And it's almost as if she knew I was embarrassed by her or even by her presence at times. And so she would often cup my face in her hands and she would say thank you, and she will tell me beautiful things about my father, how he's a good man, he was kind, and the things that, so I had wonderful reinforcements about who I am and who my parents were. That's the only way that she could say thank you. Fast forward to our emigration to Canada in 2004, where my husband took up a professorship at Dalhousie University and was the James R. Johnson Chair in Black Canadian Studies. We had a crisis in our life. We hit a crisis in 2007 when he was involved in a near fatal accident. He suffered brain injuries. He was 3 of his 4 limbs were broken, and eventually he found himself in a wheelchair. I had to push him around in Halifax, through the streets of Halifax in a wheelchair. And I discovered how difficult that is. I had to advocate for him. I had his power of attorney. I was the person who accompanied him on many of his trips to the hospitals to have conversations about where he's at in his development. He had to teach himself to read and write all over again. So that was pretty difficult. And for 3 years, I did not carry my own keys because there was always somebody at home to care for him. Now, how did that feel for me? And when I look back on that situation, it was a very difficult time because having to support someone with a disability who's having to learn to read and write all over again, learn to do everything for himself, personal care, it wasn't very easy, and still having to maintain a job and care for the family. But Now he has recovered some significantly way beyond what the doctors and nurses had predicted his recovery. But he's still disabled. But he will never tell you that he's a disabled person. In fact, he retired because of his disability. And so going to drive in our car, people see him step out of the car. And people would look at us as if to say, why do you have that badge? He could never drive. He can't drive. Because he wouldn't remember the streets. He wouldn't remember the signs. He wouldn't remember where to go. But people would always look at us as if to say, why are you in that spot? So we make these assumptions. Depending on who we are, how we see individuals, we never stop to think that that individual's disability might be invisible, which in his case it is. And even persons with disability would look at us and say, well, what are you doing here? Because of the assumptions that we make about each other. So if we could move to the next slide, please. And those assumptions that we make is what our social psychologists call unconscious bias. They argue that our brains are hardwired to behave in a certain way. Next slide, please. And so with that behavior, we all hold beliefs about various social identities and various groups. And these are where the bias they stem from. So our brains tend to categorize them. And so by default, we begin to stereotype people. And also, we tend to run away from those individuals who make us feel uncomfortable. Next slide, please. So the question that I would ask is, what is your knowledge and understanding of working with persons with disability? And do you rely on the individuals in your organization to be the spokesperson on disability issues? Those are things that we have to think about. We also have to think about what is our understanding of living in this community, living in a world where persons with disability are seen as less than. I just want you to think about that for a moment. And if you have a question, please feel free. Or a comment, for that matter. Okay, let's move on. Don't be shy now. So, even though we have to build a culture in our workplace, we need to start by ensuring that we have the appropriate tools. And for many people, people would often say that, well, I can't do this because it incurs a lot of expense. And my response would be to employers, you need to consider the return on your investment by engaging with a person with a disability. Because oftentimes, we don't stop to think about what they have to bring to the table in terms of their skills, in terms of their abilities. We just focus on what is before us. And we don't tend to recognize their intelligence. Yes? Okay, shall we move on? According to the UN, that despite substantial progress, disabled people remain significantly less likely to be in employment than a non-disabled person. They continue to be marginalized, and they continue to be mistreated and generally not thought of when decisions are being made. And you know, to a large extent, I believe that, and I still believe it. I believe it to be true. I am proud to say that one of the best employers I had, one of the best bosses I had here in Nova Scotia was somebody who is paraplegic. That did not stop him from thinking critically, positively, identifying the issues that are at stake, addressing issues to do with systemic discrimination, addressing racism in our community, and addressing issues to do with persons with disabilities. In fact, even though I was working and we were working at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, it wasn't until when he joined us as our executive director that we really understood what it means to be working with a person with disabilities. Because he just didn't engage himself. He engaged his colleagues who are like mind, and his colleagues who themselves were individuals with disabilities. And I would never forget the experience with one person who is well known in our community. When he came into our office for the first time, we were all busy shoving notes under his nose to ask, how do we communicate with you? When in fact that lesson was so simple that we could have asked him before he entered into our office, now, how do we communicate with you? And he would have told us quite simply, I would use my BlackBerry that would convey the message through cart and then come back and answer your questions. It was as simple as that. But yet still, and we were at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and we could not relate or communicate in an effective way with someone with a disability. Can we move to the next slide, please? Generally, once again, according to the UN, and this is really quite up-to-date information, during this pandemic period, generally, persons with disabilities have more health needs than others, both standard needs and needs linked to impairment, and therefore are more vulnerable to the impact of low quality and inaccessible healthcare than others. Compared to a person without disability, persons with disabilities are more likely to have poor health. And this is among 43 countries. 42% of those persons are persons with disabilities versus 6% of persons without disabilities are perceived to having poor health. Yes? Next slide, please. And Marcus, coming up, there is, yes, this link. I wondered whether if you could please access it and play it for us, because I think it's a very important one, because it really highlights some of the issues in this period of pandemic situation that we're experiencing. So in the meantime, are there any questions?
So, and we have a bit of a conversation going on in the chat box.
Yes.
So a lot of people right now are sharing their own experiences working with individuals who have a disability, and how the fact that they're presented with having to think about solutions for barriers that they're faced with every day, they're able to come up with solutions to many barriers in the workplace, and come up with ideas that many people actually wouldn't have thought of before because of that skill. So that's really awesome. And then somebody also just opened a question. So Stephen Knoll said, with the idea of a spokesperson in mind, whom will have the opportunity to speak for people with disabilities, it's interesting that health authorities all across the country, I believe, are the worst employers of people with disabilities. They're actually the most discriminating employers. It seems quite a contradiction because the fit is an obvious one.
Yes, yeah. Whereas we should be more caring, they should be the ones who should be leading the way with this, but they're not.
And sorry, Anne.
They should be the ones who should be leading the way, yes?
Absolutely. And Allison asked where the chat box is. So Allison, if you hover your mouse under the bottom of Zoom there, you'll see some tabs appear, and there's an option for a chat box. If you just want to have an open discussion, that's not really a question, feel free to use that. If you want to ask a question, you can just use the question and answer tab that's there.
Wonderful. Any other questions? I think we're getting there, Marcus.
Yes, I have the screen up now. Can you
Yes.
see Ashley and Ann? Okay.
You can play now. Yes.
Play it, and I hope the sound works. I hope everybody can see it. If not, just let us know in the chat box and we'll try to fix it. But I'm going to play it now.
Wonderful.
COVID-19 crisis is affecting every aspect of our societies, revealing the extent of exclusion that the most marginalized members of society experience. Today, I would like to highlight how the pandemic is affecting the world's 1 billion people with disabilities. Even under normal circumstances, persons with disabilities are less likely to access education, healthcare, and income opportunities, or participate in the community. This is exacerbated for those in humanitarian and fragile contexts. People with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty, and they experience higher rates of violence, neglect, and abuse. The pandemic is intensifying these inequalities and producing new threats. Today, we are launching a report that recommends a disability-inclusive response and recovery for everyone. People with disabilities are among the hardest hit by COVID-19. They face a lack of accessible public health information, significant barriers to implement basic hygiene measures, and inaccessible health facilities. If they contract COVID-19, many are more likely to develop severe health conditions which may result in death. The share of COVID-19 related deaths in care homes, where older people with disabilities are overrepresented, ranges from 19% to an astonishing 72%. In some countries, healthcare rationing decisions are based on discriminatory criteria, such as age or assumptions about quality or value of life based on disability. We cannot let this continue. We must guarantee the equal rights of people with disabilities to access healthcare and life-saving procedures during the pandemic.
So Marcus, it looks like we lost the sound there.
Which has surged during the pandemic. I urge governments to...
We lost sound, did we?
It just came back then, strangely enough.
Oh, okay, I'll just rewind it a little tiny bit then.
Okay.
There we go.
And only 1% in low-income countries. People with disabilities, particularly women and girls, face a greater risk of domestic violence, which has surged during the pandemic. I urge governments to place people with disabilities at the center of COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, and to consult and engage with people with disabilities. Persons with disabilities have valuable experience to offer of thriving in situations of isolation and alternate working arrangements. Looking to the future, we have a unique opportunity to design and implement more inclusive and accessible societies to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Last year, I launched the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy to ensure the UN system is doing its part. The strategy represents the UN's commitment to achieve transformative and lasting change. When we secure the rights of people with disabilities, we are investing in our common future.
Excellent.
And so, Anne, before we continue, Heather had a question she'd like to add.
Sure.
So she said, in reference to Archie Beale's comment in the chat, I have been searching to discover any organizations that support African, Nova Scotian, and Black folks who live with disabilities. Are there specific organizations or groups you know of that could do this type of work?
Well, I'm not aware of any organization that is specifically related to addressing issues pertaining to people of African descent. I would rely on someone like Archie Beale's knowledge if he's on the chat, but not that I'm aware. And also I'd rely on Marcus to let me know, because we have worked together on a number of occasions, but I think this is done on an individual basis. But we don't have an organization as such.
Thank you, Anne. Somebody else just added CANSA, C-A-N-S-A. So I'm not sure if that's an organization.
Yeah, CANSA. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you for sharing.
And I can address that quickly, Anne, just for a quick sec. You're right, there is no organization that specifically is mandated to support people who are from the African communities or African descent and disability. However, all the Nova Scotia Works across Nova Scotia are mandated to provide support to all groups, including people from marginalized communities, racialized communities, and person disabilities. And I think that's an important topic that Archie brought up, is that intersectionality that happens from people who have disabilities, but also from another underrepresented group. So I think that's an important topic as well.
I agree, and we do need individuals in this particular space to work with us, because there is a significant need in this area for our community, increasingly, especially around mental health issues. We know we have individuals who work, but not as an organized group. So this is something that we might want to start to consider, perhaps as one of the leading organizations here, and Teamworks, as well as those in government, might want to give some consideration to a conversation around how do we begin to work with, because you know what? They are here and they're hidden. Mm-hmm. They're in people's homes. We don't see too many people out in the streets, persons from the people of African descent with in the wheelchair. We don't see them physically. They're within their communities, and that community offers a level of safety and protection. And so we need to explore that. And I noticed Archie talked about HARC, the Health Association of African Canadians, and the Association of Black Social Workers do their very best to address and to identify these issues. But we probably need an organization that's specifically related to addressing them.
Yeah, absolutely. And Archie, I'd love to follow up with you after this to have a conversation and to keep it going.
Excellent.
And Tammy also added that all Nova Scotia work centers located in Nova Scotia can assist all groups with employment-related issues.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Fanny.
Thank you. Okay, can we move to the next slide? If there are no more questions on the United Nations video, but I'm sure that you would agree when you think of 1 billion persons with disabilities around the world, and the fact that you know a significant number of those individuals are impacted. So what is it that prevents us from being more inclusive in our decision making in relation to persons with disabilities? What do you think might be the issue? Any takers? Put it in the chat. You know, there's the stereotype. Yes. Fear. Someone says fear.
Yeah.
Lack of awareness and fear that we would make mistakes. Selfishness.
The unknown. That's a
The
good
unknown.
one. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. That's a big one. And they're coming fast and furious. Old attitudes, pity. Not engaging with persons with disabilities. And that is absolutely true. Lack of empathy. We have no time. We're not interested. They're in the way. You know, when I have to tell you, when we're afraid of disrupting the status quo, right? And being self-centered.
And group segregation too. Yeah.
Absolutely, segregation, lack of communication and conversation, and asking, when was the last time you have advocated for someone with a disability? And think about what that issue was and what was the outcome. Because when you can stand up as an able-bodied person and challenge an individual on behalf of a person with disability, it's a pretty powerful thing, but generally sometimes we are embarrassed and we walk away. Yes? And the decisions that we make are not inclusive because they're usually largely absent from the table. Now you look at the boardroom, and those of you who are not in positions where you're working in an organization with a disability, just think for a moment. Look around in your organization and see who is at the board table. Do you have room for that person in a wheelchair? Do you have room for that person who has mental health issues? Are you listening? Are you hearing? Are you talking? Are you engaging? Are you using your emotional intelligence, drawing on your capacity to be empathetic and your capacity to be compassionate and self-aware? These are the questions that we must ask ourselves. We have to step outside of ourselves and become uncomfortable and have that conversation. And let me tell you about some of the uncomfortableness, because when our CEO, David Shannon, came to the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and I am so proud of him because even today, if I were to call on David Shannon for assistance, he would have no hesitation to give it to me. If David Shannon's phone fell out of his hand and went into some far place, he could not retrieve it himself. He was very much reliant on us, his staff, to retrieve that phone. And you know what? It felt to us that we were invading his personal space. But for him, he never showed whether if he was embarrassed or he never made us feel embarrassed to support him. Similarly, when you get to understand someone with a disability, outside of your own circles, because we all know someone, the next fifth person who has a disability, because according to the statistics, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 4 persons report a disability, and 1 in 5 persons have a mental health issue within our workplace. So we are not that far away. So how do we begin? How can we pretend that we don't see it? Or how can we ignore it in our workplace? So what are you saying to me in the chat? Anything? Okay, let's move on. Is anyone saying anything in the chat?
We had a little conversation there. Charlene said some employers, I'm assuming she's referring to, don't want to step outside of their comfort zone. And then Archie also added, when we step outside of our comfort zones and become uncomfortable, that is when real learning happens. Authentic language.
Yeah, that is when real change takes place, right? And we have to recognize the sense of urgency in the change. We have to educate our employees. We have to educate our workforce so that they can buy in to, and it takes leadership. It takes a courageous leader to, which it shouldn't have to. It should just be natural, the way we do things around here. It shouldn't have to take someone of courage to do something different to accommodate a person with a disability. But that's how it seems. It has to be a courageous leader to engage that person with a disability. If that person happens to be a person of color, of African descent, other things are compounded. If that person happens to be gay, how dare them have any kind of sexual orientation? Because as a disabled person, you're supposed to be asexual. You're not supposed to have any human feelings in that regard. And so these are some of the experiences that persons with disability experience every day. Our boss used to say to us, every 3 minutes, there is a microaggression going on in the workplace with regards to persons with disability. Every 3 minutes. Okay, let's move to our next slide. We can move to the next. Are we going? Okay. Right.
Is that good?
Let's talk about this, about biasness for a moment. You know, how does it happen? And how do we all feel about being biased? The interesting thing is, is that as human beings, we are all biased. And we carry these within us. It is as normal as the air we breathe. And Howard Ross says that being biased, human beings are consistently, routinely, and profoundly biased. And the fact is, we never know that we are. Yes? It happens around us. You can move the next slide, please. So, what are some of the behaviors we're talking about? And you know this. So, what is your preference when it comes to your social circles? What do you do? The fact is, we all like to be with people who are most like us. We have learned to trust women to be nurturing and men to be powerful. We might even believe that baby boomers, for example, are not good at using technology, which we know is not true, because baby boomers have been using technology from the time technology was introduced. At every stage, baby boomers have been using technology. Or do we find it hard to associate with a person with disability with success, a successful business venture or independence? Do you see such individuals around you? And what are your thoughts when you see people who are individuals with intellectual disability, for example? How do we relate to those individuals? And sometimes when we're speaking to someone in a wheelchair, even though they're successful, we still hang over them, and we are condescending towards them, rather than stooping beside them or sitting beside them and having a meaningful conversation, because that's all they would want, nothing more. Don't stand over and don't talk down. Sit down and engage. You can't walk in my shoe, but you can walk alongside me on the journey. You can sit with me, you can empathize, you can listen, you can allow me to share my story so that we can understand each other. Our cultural intelligence, we become engaged with each other. Yes. Our next slide, please. We've gone a bit quiet on the chat. You're not sleeping out there on me, are you? So, what is this thing that we call unconscious bias that everyone's been talking about? Now, in 2015, when I tell you a story, when I left government in 2014, and everyone said to me, oh, take your Rolodex and go and do some human rights work. Yes, and that was my plan, because I thought I knew everything about human rights. And then when I went into businesses and organizations and I asked if I can do some human rights work, they said, no, when we have a problem, come back, we'll find you. And so I started talking to organizations, and I started asking what is going on. And what they said to me, well, look, we have been doing diversity and inclusion. We follow the principles of employment equity. We try to engage women, people from visible minority, indigenous people, and persons with disabilities, and still we are not hitting the mark where we want to. And it meant that I went back and I did my study, and I started looking at what is it that's preventing us from moving forward with this issue. And I stumbled upon Professor Frank Dobbin from Harvard University, and was going back and forth with his work. And he said to me, you know, Anne, this thing around diversity and inclusion doesn't work. And I'm thinking, well, what does work? Then we started to talk about unconscious bias, and I was introduced to Anthony Greenwald and of Washington University and Professor Banerjee from Yale, or it could be the other way around. And they started to talk, they were talking about, since 1998, about unconscious bias and how our deep inside of us, in our psyche, we are raised, we are conditioned to behave. Our brain is hardwired to work in a particular way. So we quickly make judgments of people based on our experiences. Yes, can we move to the next slide, please? And those judgments sometimes are not necessarily true, because they come from stereotypes, attitudes, opinions, stigma about certain groups of people outside of our own conscious awareness. And these people could be those who are different from us. You know, we like to think that we behave in a certain way and that we're good people. And of course, when we look into our history, you know, we've done so in the last 50 years. We've had the civil rights movement. We have seen the destruction of the Berlin Wall, and we've seen so many changes. We've had human rights laws. Within the human rights laws, laws where we should not discriminate against persons with disabilities, but yet still we are at a place where persons with disabilities cannot find adequate and appropriate employment to make them independent, to live meaningful lives. You know? My colleague Anne, whose last name I've forgotten, would talk about, used to work in government, she used to talk about, we see people as persons with disability, Anne McCrae, more as a charitable and the medical model, rather than for us, speaking to us and being with us. You know the language, and somebody will correct me. It's nothing without us. Marcus, can you help me out here? The language that we used to use a few years ago.
Yeah, nothing about us, nothing
Without
for
us.
us without us.
Without us.
Yeah, nothing.
You know,
yeah, nothing about us without us. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is so important. It means that we need to consult. It means that we need to talk. It means that we need to ask questions. It means that we need to engage. And it also means that we're not to treat individuals as a medical case or a charity case for that matter. Because when you look around and you see organizations where it's led by persons with disabilities or for persons with disability, oftentimes it is the poor cousin of many other organizations, because people are always have to fight for funding, continuously having to make application for funding to keep an individual in place. And sometimes we get an initiative going, and it's a brilliant initiative. And without thinking, that funding gets pulled because somebody else might come up with a different idea and don't look to see the impact of what that is happening in our community when persons with disabilities have no employment or cannot truly engage in our society. Let's move to our next slide. So the question is, when have you judged a person with a disability? It could have been a visible or invisible disability. Have you been fearful of a person with intellectual disability, believing that they could not do what they say they could? And I think I've asked this question already. Have you ever advocated for a person with disability in the past? Let's explore those with intellectual disabilities. That's just one, because the spectrum is very, very, it's long. How do you relate? I don't see the chat flashing, it's gone silent. How do you relate? What are some good tips that you have that you might want to share with me, who is constantly learning about these issues? And then I myself could be biased. I think that I'm a good person. I think that I'm a great person. I think I get a lot of applause for the work that I do. And you know, I could become complacent and not think about how to support the needs of someone with a disability.
We have some comments going on here now.
Through the corner of my eyes, I could see things moving. What's being said?
So Shannon added that she advocated for her son, who's nonverbal autistic.
Yes.
Tammy also added, my son has an intellectual disability as confirmed by a psychologist, and often I say that he will just be a blue collar worker, but at 14 years old, I have no idea what he's going to do as an adult. Andrew asked a question. He said, and do you have any stories about how unconscious bias is impacting persons with disabilities or organizations that serve persons with disabilities in Nova Scotia in particular, to the impacts COVID-19 that can be shared, that you can share with everybody? And do you have some observations and recommendations to share?
Well, you know, because of COVID, we haven't actually seen, or we haven't seen anyone. I've only spoken to individuals, and I tell you somebody who might be in a good position to talk to you about this when you have something else. Paul Vino, an advocate of persons with disability. He is one of the best in Halifax. He's on the front lines. And so I would recommend that, Marcus, you bring him in, so that he can have a conversation, because I'm sure he would have lots of stories, better stories than I have, because he lives this experience every day. What I do know is that many persons with disabilities could not leave their homes because they are designated in that vulnerable category. Yes. And so as a result, and this is what I know from my friends, they have been indoors and have been reliant on individuals to support them and to assist them. The critical thing is, as we heard, a significant number of people will have lost their jobs in this period, especially persons with disabilities. They would be hit the hardest when it comes to COVID-19 and going back into the work environment. And some people have said that they're not able to wear the masks. So what happens when you're having to go into the workplace and you're not able to wear your mask, and it becomes compulsory that you use public transportation? Many of persons with disabilities that we know use public transportation. And some of them, you know, have to be accommodated differently. And so as employers, we're having to think carefully, how do we accommodate such individuals within returning into the workforce? And in some cases, they might not be able to return into the workforce, but might have to work from home.
Thanks, Anne. So we also have a comment as well. Heather shared her own experience. She said, I first started working with people with disabilities last fall, and I definitely felt fear. I absolutely had a big learning curve with working with people with developmental disorders and treating them with dignity, respect, and kindness.
Yes. You know, we just have to draw on our emotional intelligence, and, you know, as human beings, individuals, use empathy, use compassion. And sometimes persons with disability, they will tell you, I don't need your compassion. I just want you to treat me well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because sometimes the way how we speak to individuals is very condescending.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, some would say, you know, I might be deaf, but I can lip read. I do understand what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to be quite forceful about it. And when they're being forceful, people perceive them as being rude. But really, they're not being rude. We're the ones who have to step back and listen to how we would have engaged with those individuals in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. Andrea shared her strategies. She said she tries to be mindful and paying attention to her thoughts and her own mental reactions in situations, experiences.
Yes. Yeah. And, you know, we have to be mindful and be careful not to pass judgment, because we don't know the person's story. We just make assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be mindful not to be judgmental, not to stereotype. And, you know, we would often think, oh, well, it's his fault or her fault or something happened, or any number of reasons people get accused of. For example, one of the most discriminated communities in Africa are people who are albinos. And they are seen differently. And oftentimes they've been ill-treated, they've been murdered, they're being seen as a curse on their community. and their lives are at risk. And sometimes you become, you are an able-bodied person, but later on in your experience, because of health reasons, you may become a disabled person or a person with a disability. We just don't know. So we are always having to be mindful how we relate to individuals, how we speak to them, how we treat them, because this is so important, and how we advocate.
Absolutely. There's a lot of conversation going on in the chat box. This is awesome. A lot of people are talking about the practice of empathy and how you can apply your own experiences sometimes in a situation with a new group of individuals that you're working with.
Yes.
And Charlene just added that critical and thoughtful thinking helps. Example, no matter what you might see and hear from different forms of media, treat each person and his or her disability as unique every time. Not all people on the intellectual and autism spectrums are on the same spectrum, so we cannot treat them as though we know it all because of past experiences, especially when our own personal experiences might be so limited.
Right. And that is so wonderful, Charlene, because each person is unique.
Yeah.
And
there's a saying in the autism community, if you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, right?
Yeah.
You can't generalize all autism people into one group. I love that saying.
Yeah. And speaking of sayings, Sherry just said that she heard the statement decades ago and she's always remembered it. And that is, it is not that I am disabled, it is that you are temporarily abled.
And that is so true.
Mm-hmm.
That is so true, because you know what, any moment you could be the strongest person and anything can happen.
Mm-hmm.
That puts you in that situation. And I know that from personal experience. One minute my husband was walking along the streets of on Lacewood Drive, and the next minute he was hit by a car. And then, you know, it took him a long time to recover. And it was a journey, a painful journey for all of us, the entire family. And, you know, that sense that on many occasions we felt Nova Scotia was behind us, pushing us along, because each time we were out on the street, people would encourage him and cheer him along. So, you know, we've all got our story to tell. We've all got a journey that we're on, and that has to be validated and respected. Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments.
Yes, it's brilliant. Okay, let's move on. Right, these statistics, and you can tell me more, because this is, and I was looking to equate them with the statistics here in Canada, but over a third of people tend to think of disabled people not as productive as anyone else, you know. Isn't that incredible? Unconscious bias against disabled people appear to be higher than any other social group. Can you believe that? Over 1 in 3 people show an unconscious bias against those with a disability, higher than levels on the basis of higher than levels of bias on the basis of gender or race. I was alarmed when I read that, because I thought it was going to be race and gender, but I had no idea that it was disability. And so what do we do about that when that person comes before us for a job interview? How do we behave? Do we accommodate them? Do we prepare ourselves to meet their needs when they come to us for an interview? Do we treat them like any other candidate? Do we ask what are their accessibility needs? Do we check how we can accommodate them? There's still some buildings in Nova Scotia, in the city of Halifax, that is totally inaccessible to persons with disabilities. And we see them as listed buildings. But should they remain that way? Or should we open them up? That's an issue for our community. But then when we go back into the work environment, what is our position now after COVID-19? What preparations are we making as we're making preparations for people to get back into the workforce? What preparation are we making for those with persons with disabilities in order to accommodate them? Are they a second thought? Or is it that we have it in our strategic plan to include individuals with disabilities, to check in, to ask what are their needs, and to ensure that those needs are in place? These are challenging questions for all of us to think about. Any questions? Any comments? Let's move on. Employment rates vary by type of disability. Employment rates are higher for people with hearing, 51%, and vision disability, 41%, and lowest for those with self-care and independent disabilities. These are American statistics, but I believe there is no difference in Canada. I believe it's the same. And in some instances, for some work environments, it might be worse. And with employment and with human rights and employment equity legislation, why do we still encounter these difficulties and differences? Yes? Any questions? Any comments? Any observations? Because I think this is a really important one. Okay, let's move forward.
Actually, Anne,
Yeah.
Shar, one comment.
Yes.
Saw it now. I think it might be even higher if studies are self-reported. Example, i.e., people will tend to answer more positively on surveys for fear of being judged for their honesty, even if that honesty is only known by them. Example,
Yes.
even answers are supposed to be anonymous.
Now that is really interesting. Are there any comments in our community on this point? How do we check? How do we know? So you're absolutely right. It could be even higher than is actually reported, because people are fearful of. And there are many people still today who are very fearful of admitting that they have certain types of disabilities, particularly if it's invisible. People tend to keep it to themselves. They don't want anyone to know because they feel embarrassed. People are still embarrassed about certain illnesses. People are highly embarrassed about COVID. I've lost friends, I've lost family members due to COVID, and it was almost like, hush, he's got the COVID. And that was no fault of their own. But there seemed to be kind of stigma around certain illnesses. And that illness is because that person health had already been compromised due to a form of disability. People are very hushed about it because we still feel embarrassed by persons with disabilities in our community, even in our family lives. you know, we're still embarrassed by that. There's still a stigma that's attached, and it should not be. My battery power is running out, and I'm looking for my charger. So please chat. Can someone continue a chat, Marcus? Let me try and get mine.
No problem. I saw there was a comment about the presentation doesn't have ASL interpretation right now, and that is true. We don't. However, we did meet with the deaf community yesterday, Ashley and I, for over an hour to go over all what is needed to provide ASL interpretation. We have done it before. However, the people that were going to attend decided not to attend anyway. They were too busy. But just so everybody knows, in the future, we will have and plan to have ASL interpretation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please keep going.
Yep. What's some of the other comments here?
Andrea asked a question. She said, should we generally ask everyone if they have any accessibility needs when they are coming into new environments, and how can we support them? You know, I think that's really unique because there's so many different types of disabilities. It's really difficult sometimes to not miss people, you know. But, you know, the best things that we can do is to give them opportunity to let us know. Like, you know, if somebody does have a hearing issue, you know, they can let us know. We include that in our registration form for our webinars so that, you know, we can make sure we don't miss anybody if they need that. And just like Marcus said, me and Marcus are working right now to make all of our future webinars after this one, make sure they do have closed captioning and ASL interpreters as well. So I think it's just really always working towards making your services, your physical building environment as accessible and inclusive as you possibly can. And that's always changing. It's always growing. It's just one way we can grow as a business, you know?
I think that is a good thing to keep in mind to ask people. I liked Anne's example earlier on when she had a new person working at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and they had all these plans on how to communicate. And when the person got there, they were just like, well, you can just do this. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is to have those conversations. And often persons with disabilities have gone through the whole lives of solving problems and being, you know, looking at solutions and stuff. So sometimes the best answer is to just ask them. And
exactly.
The other piece around that is, you know, the unconscious bias that we have all in us every day, and trying to be aware of that. And we have a person on staff at Teamwork who was blind, and we will often forget when we send a picture out to put the alt text on it. Yeah. And I always beat myself up, but the Stephanie, she's like, it's okay. And she reminds us, but it's just so easy to, because it's all, as Anne was saying, we were taught at an early age, or we brought up in an early age, and in a particular way that develops these judgments and these biases. And I think the best thing that we can do is just to be constantly aware of it.
Absolutely.
I like what Morak said, that I'm comfortable now to disclose I have a significant hearing loss, but for years I did not, because of embarrassment.
Yeah.
You know, thank you for sharing that, because we should not feel that way. Yeah. And also I appreciate what the person said from a human rights perspective. You cannot ask if you are if you're in a meeting for a job interview. No, there is provisions for that, but it's also your responsibility to inform the interviewing panel if you have any needs for a disability, or if you need any form of accommodation, because if you don't, then they don't know how to accommodate you. And it's really important that that is stated, and so that the interviewing panel are aware. Anything else? Okay, let's move on. How are we doing for time, Marcus?
Let's see. We have 5 minutes.
Okay, well, that's good. So what we need to do to counter our biases. You know, we need to start doing some stuff. We need to start working hard at making that mental, psychological shift in our thinking and our behavior. We need to make a conscious effort. We need to be intentional. And not only intentional, because we can have good intentions and we can get it so wrong. We need to act. We need to engage with those individuals who knows what this feels like to be discriminated against. And we need to have person-centered approach. Be open at looking at each and every individual in our group, right? We can help each person, regardless of whether if they're disabled or not, to do the best job, to bring their best selves to work. We have the capacity to do that. And we need to find out what approach we as a team would do, would work at. One of the things I love whenever I go to team works, they always seem to have everything organized, prepared, laid out. So, and you know, it's interesting what Marcus said about our colleague, whose name escapes me, one of the most eloquent people. You know, we need to, the sense of inclusivity is often lived out, I believe, whenever I go to teamwork. Their offices, I don't need to ask. I can see it. And so it should be visible to everyone who engage with this organization. And that's how I've always felt. So long may that continue. And other organizations across the province and across the country, let us work together to ensure that every person feels included in what we're doing, in our strategic plan. It has to be a common thread in our organizations that runs through diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. In fact, it's inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. Some people call it IDEA. Let's move on. Break down those barriers. Talk to our customers. Ask them about how they feel, how understanding about working with a person with a disability. Be willing to listen and not make any judgments. And they have had better service or worse. We need to do a lot more surveys around what happens within our organization, what happens within the services that we provide, in a similar way that we did the consumer profile survey on Black people's experience while shopping. We need to consider doing something like that for persons with disabilities. You know, we didn't set about asking people whether if they were Black or white. We just asked what was their shopping experience. And this is something that we probably consider. It would be very telling about the experience of persons with disabilities. And a lot will come out about people's biases, whether consciously or unconsciously. Because some of it we are very much aware of, and there are others that we are not so aware of. We have to be called out. Encourage your colleagues within your organization to call you out on your bias. Be willing to have open conversations about how we make each other feel within our organizations. Our team meetings need to be more informative about what's going on in our communities and around us within our organizations. Because oftentimes people tend to hide behind their computers. People tend to hide behind so many things. During this pandemic period, I do know that a lot of mothers, young women, have experienced some awful bullying from their managers. And I would imagine that would have been the same. The kind of bullying would have been the same for persons with disabilities. Let's move on. I think that might be the last slide, but yes. Let's take action, build a community in your network, engage with a not-for-profit organization pertaining to disabilities, review your organization accessibilities, policies, and practice, and join an employee resource group for persons with disabilities. Mentor someone with a disability and build a strong relationship with them. The options are endless and we all can do it. Every last one of us can undertake to do something with a person with a disability. Shall we go again? Now, here's your chance to ask me questions. Please. Are you still out there?
I'm sure they are, yes.
Any comments in the chat box?
A lot are giving their sincere thanks to you and saying that they have learned so much today, both on a professional and personal level. So they thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you all very much. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. I wish I could see everyone.
Well, this is a little different where you can't see people, you can't see the reactions and kind of read the crowd.
Yeah.
No, you can't. It's a tough one, isn't it? Thank you so much.
Yeah, lots of comments are coming in about, you know, people seeing it as eye-opening, very informative, a lot to reflect on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, Ashley and I appreciate it as well.
Absolutely.
For coming today and sharing your experience, your personal experience is what I thought was quite moving in the beginning.
Thank you.
And all the topics that you brought up throughout, I think gave us a lot to reflect on, a lot to take home to
Yes.
our lives, a lot to take back to our communities, a lot to take back to our work.
Yes.
Which was the whole point of the presentation. So I think there is a lot that we can take back and think about and also put into action.
Yeah.
It's not good enough just to be intentional and say we're going to do these things. We have to have actions behind them. And one of the things that I get out of this, and I think it's important, is kind of being comfortable with those uncomfortable conversations, you know, kind of lead with vulnerability and being okay with it. So I do appreciate everything that you brought today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne.
I am learning also. I am learning every day, and thank you for the opportunity, because it helps me to reflect on my own behavior, the way how I conduct myself, how I conduct my business, and to remind me that I also need to be even more inclusive in the way how I do things. Yeah. Thank you.
Pat Gorman said, "Thanks so much for this, Anne. Not an easy format from which to teach, but your knowledge and warmth shone through." I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, Teresa asked if she can see the previous slide.
Yes, I'll bring that back. There you go, Teresa.
Sure.
And for anyone else that's on the still on the call, on the webinar, we will be sending out surveys as well to emails. So just look out for that so we can get some feedback and keep learning ourselves.
Yes, thank you.
We just had another comment. Stephen said, "I tend to think that human rights have to unfold in a natural way, and disability rights haven't quite been made a priority yet, but we're getting close. After all, it was only 103 years ago that the only people who were allowed to vote were white men." That's true.
Yeah.
You know.
Good point, Steve. Very good point.
Yes. Well, we need to speed up that thinking, because we don't want to be lagging behind.
That's right.
No, the time has come when we need to be in the forefront of everything. After all,
yeah, and what a better time now with, you know, our links to technology and how easy it is to share our experiences, you know?
Yeah.
well, you know what? In terms of technology, the world has finally caught up with the disability community, because one of the things that I do know is that the disability community leads the way when it comes to using technology. And
For sure.
we are just finally just getting caught up with the community, because one thing sure I learned when I went into the Human Rights Commission was, you know, whilst we're talking about how do we communicate, the disability community, the deaf community, were using TTY, and they were communicating with each other. So you know, the community is reliant upon technology, and they can teach us a few things about technology.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, I think we can close it off now. Do you have anything to add, Ashley?
No, just thank you very much, and really appreciate you taking the time to be part of this. I'm so grateful for just to listen to you speak. It was such a great presentation, and to thank you for everybody else for joining as well.
A great audience too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Anne.
Bye.